Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for packing the room to see my beloved. I was gonna have an official bio to say for you, but I should be able to just rattle it off. So I will do that. Raff is a professor at Chicago Kent College of Law, right? Every law school calls himself something different. He got his PhD in philosophy and JD at Northwestern University. That's when we met, when he was finishing that up. He has been a professor at LSU and at Penn State, at Dickinson Law School, before we came back here to Chicago. And he is currently a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Miami in Florida. So he's been flying back and forth this semester. I went down to Miami a couple weeks ago to visit with him, and his flight back to Miami was just canceled for this evening, so I get to hold on to him for a few more days. Anyway, thank you, darling, so much for talking to my beloved community and sharing your incredible wisdom and knowledge. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Thanks. So Dan clearly thought to himself, I know how to get Raff to go to spiritual growth. Just have him speak at it. So as Dan mentioned, I am a professor at Chicago Kent, which is part of IIT, the Illinois Institute of Technology, or Illinois Tech as they have rebranded. At Chicago Kent, I teach courses in criminal law and procedure, constitutional law, and legal theory, or in plainer terms, I teach about things like how police should work, which things should be crimes, how the government should be structured, and which rights we have. So only the least controversial topics, as you can see. So my theme today is the convict or convicts. And so I'll start off talking about one of my favorite crimes to discuss, which is shoplifting or retail theft, as it's been rebranded. Estimates about lifetime prevalence of shoplifting vary. Lifetime prevalence is how many people at some point in their lives will have committed shoplifting. At the low end, some sources report that 5% of Americans have shoplifted at some point in their lives. So that's 1 in 20 people. How many people are in this room? Of course, most experts actually doubt that 5% number and think that the number is much higher. The National Association of Shoplifting Prevention, which is a lobbying group about shoplifting, they suggest the number is more like 9% of Americans. A scientific article published in the American Journal of Psychiatry suggests that it's just over 11%. But a survey from just 2 years ago suggests that a whopping 23% of Americans have shoplifted. So, as I said, the numbers vary. So the true number could be anywhere from 5 to nearly 25% of Americans. Now, given that our country has about 340 million people, that means anywhere from 17 million to over 75 million Americans have shoplifted or will shoplift at some point in their lives. So we know lots and lots of people do this, but what is shoplifting exactly? We all, I take it, know the central case of shoplifting. You see the item on the shelf, you tuck it into your jacket, and you walk out without paying for it. But there are other things that count as shoplifting too. With the rise of self-checkout, don't get ahead of me. There's a new favorite form of not ringing up every single item. So that counts, of course, as shoplifting. That is called under-ringing in the Illinois statute. When you're shopping for clothes, do you ever see a sales sticker on one item that you wish could be on the item that you want. If you were to move that sticker and then pay the reduced price, that is shoplifting as well under the Illinois statute. Did you know, I just found this out this morning, did you know that if you remove the shopping cart from the store without the intention to return it, that also counts as shoplifting, even if you paid for every item in it? So, shoplifting is defined very expansively. And, as we just learned, lots and lots of people do it. So what happens if you're one of the unfortunate people who gets caught? Suppose that the retail value of the item is just $10. What do you think, under Illinois law, is the maximum penalty? This is a real question. What do we think? What?
Slap on the wrist.
Slap on the wrist. That's the maximum penalty.
You're in jail.
Okay, jail, how long? 30 days?
$50 fine, 6 months in jail.
6 months? 30? Any other?
1 year.
1 year.
Oh, come on.
The maximum jail time is 1 year for the ordinary case of a $10 theft. However, if you steal the $10 item and leave via an emergency exit, the maximum penalty is 3 years. Now, to be clear, most people do not receive sentences of this magnitude, but you can. Our society has decided that these can be appropriate sentences for first-time offenders stealing just $10 in merchandise. Imagine for a moment what would happen to you in your life if you were kind of taken away from your life for a year, or even just 6 months, or even just 3 months, which is much more like a typical sentence when there is jail time at all. What would happen to your job if you were absent for 3, 6, or 12 months all at once? If you have a boss, she's likely going to fire you. If you're your own boss, that's still probably not so good for business. What happens to the client if their deliverable is delayed for months and you're basically unreachable as people are in jail? What happens to your home if you're not paying the rent or mortgage for a year? And even if you own your home free and clear, what will the state do if you're not paying those property taxes? What happens to your kids? What happens to your partner? What happens to your friendships, your standing in the community? Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that petty retail theft should be ignored. It raises costs for all of us, and everyone knows those are high enough. And it's certainly a headache for those who work in retail. My point is that the laws concerning shoplifting, and indeed many other crimes, do not reflect a gracious society. So one of the themes I understand in our spiritual growth series has been the need to extend grace to ourselves. When we extend grace to ourselves, we can extend grace to others. When I excuse or even celebrate the ways that I'm a weirdo, say, I might come to see that being weird isn't so bad and might excuse or even celebrate the weirdness of others. And if we all do that, we build a world that is more inclusive and loving. But I want to highlight something a little different. I want to highlight times when we might be all too willing to extend grace to ourselves and maybe members of our own tribe, but not to others beyond. And this can happen in 2 ways. First, sometimes we extend grace to ourselves about the very thing that we deny grace to others. And sometimes, second, we fail to extend grace to others facing circumstances where we would want someone to be gracious with us. Now, on the first thing, grace for me, but not for thee, this is arguably present in our shoplifting example. As we kind of already learned, tens of millions of Americans have shoplifted. And for each of us who has, we might make excuses for ourselves. I was young, inflation was high, they were overcharging anyway. But we, at least on the societal level, have no grace for those who do these same things. We are willing to put these people away. Now, the second thing, no grace for you when I would want to have grace for me. This is trickier to talk about, but I think it's especially important for communities like ours. We are in a church. We are, for the most part, adults who came here voluntarily. Nobody was dragged here kicking and screaming. And if you were, that's called kidnapping. We can talk about that crime later. Now, as members of a religious community, many of us have a very strong moral compass and have never shoplifted, much less committed any more serious wrongdoing. Also, as a middle class and perhaps even well-to-do group, the financial allure of petty retail theft probably isn't there. As such, many of us don't need others' grace about criminal matters. We do not commit crimes and are not hypocritical if we should judge others harshly for the crimes that they commit. But here's perhaps a different perspective. We have been blessed to have circumstances that make it easy to avoid crime and certain other serious wrongdoing. A philosopher friend of mine calls this living on moral easy street. Now, I admit when she first shared this with me, it was really hard for me not to think of the song Easy Street from the musical Annie. Imagining Bernadette Peters, Carol Burnett, Tim Curry singing it in the 1982 version of the musical. Anyway, moral easy street, let's not talk about theft, but moral easy street, to use my friend's metaphor, is the life that many of us lead where it's easy to be good. Not necessarily moral heroes or superhuman saints, but just plain good. The residents of moral easy street, as it were, can easily refrain from shoplifting. They say please and thank you. They give a little to charity. And it's easy to do those things when life isn't throwing major crises your way. When you have enough to eat without stealing it, a roof over your head, when your life has meaning and purpose, and other opportunities to stave off boredom, when you're not faced with violence or addiction, you're not particularly susceptible to manipulation by those who would bid you to do evil on their behalf. When all those things are true, you're in a good place. You're on moral easy street. But just as I listed out those conditions, you can perhaps easily see what it would be like not to be on moral easy street, to be on what my friend calls moral hard street. And if we were there, I suggest that we would want a bit of grace. But by the grace of God, we aren't there. Now, there's much more that I could mention with respect to grace and the criminal justice system. It's a huge topic that Dan gave me, and I decided to shrink it down to one thing. But I just want to flag some things that we could talk about that I haven't yet. There's so much more I could talk about how the criminal justice system does and sometimes does not extend grace. I could talk about excuses to criminal liability, some things related to the person when they are given grace, like people who are young or have diminished capacities or mental illness. Can talk about other ways that we excuse criminal wrongdoing, like when people are subject to duress. I could also talk about ways kind of beyond criminal trials, or in addition to criminal trials, where there's grace inserted into the criminal justice system. Things like diversion programs, where we can formally find someone guilty of a crime, but do something other than punish them in the traditional way of jail time and fines. I could also talk about the racial and class ways that we sometimes extend grace, and again, refuse to. But I'll leave it there for now and invite your questions and conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because it's like a lot of things, there's extremes. You know, on the one extreme, someone who's starving, who takes food, you know, you want to help them and feed them. A teenager that, you know, just did something stupid on a dare. But on the other extreme, you have people shoplifting with intent to intimidate, to harm. I guess they tell retailers, let the person go. I think someone recently got killed in Chicago just because he called out one. So there are ranges here like everything else. So I'm just wondering, how does the legal system handle these ranges that are very different?
Great question. So just to repeat it, sometimes there's kind of different levels of kind of moral culpability involved with different kinds of, we'll say, theft.
This mic is just very, yeah, all screwed up.
All right, great. Yeah, so there's different levels of kind of culpability. So there's a lot of things to say here, but I guess I'll start with mentioning that there are a lot of theft-related crimes, and I focus perhaps intentionally on a narrow one, which is shoplifting. So shoplifting occurs when you take something from a retail establishment, like an item for sale or sometimes a shopping cart, and that is all shoplifting is. If you do additional things while you're shoplifting, then those are different sorts of crimes. So for instance, suppose the store is closed and you break into it. That's not shoplifting. That's burglary. Burglary is always a felony. And it's a much more serious crime, and there are much more serious consequences, even if no one is hurt. So if you burglarize a store, for instance, I think the minimum penalty is 3 years in Illinois, and I think the max is 7. And that's just a regular burglary where you just go in with the intention to steal something. Then if you, say, have a weapon or threaten to use a weapon, in the case that you're suggesting, that's not shoplifting and that's not burglary. That's actually robbery. And that's an even more serious crime than shoplifting or burglary. And then if you should kill someone, God forbid that should happen, while you are robbing them, which is a felony, you committed a felony murder. And that sentence in Illinois is usually life in prison. So there are a lot of grades to various kinds of property crimes. So at the shoplifting or retail theft is kind of at the very lowest level. But even though it is at the lowest level, the maximum penalties are still very, very serious. And another thing I didn't kind of emphasize, but I could have, is that I gave you the maximum penalty for a first-time offender. If you are a second-time offender, there are actually more serious maximum penalties. But I think you're absolutely right to recognize there are kind of levels to all of this. And the criminal justice system does respond to it, in my mind, appropriately in the sense that, like, it treats the things that are more serious more seriously. But I think there are questions to be asked about, is the maximums on each of these, are those appropriate?
Just a point in regards to your $10 example. you would agree that looking at grace, on the front end of that $10, a part of that $10, retail theft is included in there. It might only be a quarter. It might be 50 cents. You would agree. Might, in some cases, $1. So as a community, in your example here, well-to-do community, we all share in that practice. And I'm still trying to hang on, I guess, the front end of this grace. In other words, what does the retailer think of grace when he's added in that quarter? I know something's going to be stolen from my store, so I'll jack it up, or in that $10, I'm adding 50 cents in there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there's various ways that retailers already are aware of this possibility, both in terms of how they price goods initially, but also in terms of insurance. Which is why, just to be frank, why many retailers don't report shoplifting and certainly don't send employees to go and testify in court that they saw someone shoplifting, because it's really not worth it. They've already priced it in. You could then ask the further question then about why do we have these extremely high penalties when there is a social cost, but the social cost in a certain sense has already been paid.
We have a question online that we already partially covered. Repeated offenses, they do have a more serious punishment. What is the study of repeated offense turning into more serious crime?
Right. Yes. So famously, many have argued, and it's totally correct to argue that low-level crimes are a gateway to more serious crimes in the following sense. It's pretty uncommon that your first crime is going to be a robbery. That is, so a robbery, remember again, is a theft, but where you use or threaten to use a weapon to effectuate the theft. People typically don't start doing that. They might have done something a bit more minor first. Now, with that said, maybe 75 million people have shoplifted, so like everyone has done that. So it's not clear that it kind of causes this, but it's true that people do the small things before they do other sorts of things. The other thing to mention that kind of I touched on a little bit and talking about imagine what should happen if you're taken away from your life for 3 or 6 or 12 months. The process of being incarcerated is one that is criminogenic. That is, it disposes people to commit more crimes, because if you should be taken away from your life for 6 months or a year or something of the sort, then how are you exactly going to earn money? What happens to your support system? What happens when people in your life don't extend grace to you? People then turn to different sorts of criminal activity, and sometimes more serious ones. And so I think one of the great things that we're doing, particularly in Cook County, is all these kinds of diversion programs to try to not take people away from their lives, because that does have these really bad consequences, unintended consequences. I mean, it seems to make sense, right? Someone does something bad, give them a consequence that's serious, and they won't do it again. Sure, they may not want to do it again, but it turns out it has this consequence of making some people turn to lives of much serious criminality. And so we've developed these diversionary programs where people kind of are court supervised, but they're not actually incarcerated. And that seems to have pretty good outcomes. The only reason why we don't expand this further is really resources.
Now, I have a question about judicial grace.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the person who steals something for under $10. They go before the judge, and one judge says, all right, slap on the wrist, and the other one says, no, 1 year in jail. How do we, balance that?
This is a really great question, and one that instead of answer, I'm going to dance around by telling you a story. So I'll just tell you a story about our history with this sort of thing and what we've done over time. So 75 years ago or so, for most serious crimes in Illinois and across the country, really, we had indeterminate sentences. And so how long was your sentence, especially for serious crimes, say that was a felony? 1 to 50 years. That was your sentence. And you kind of would check in with the judge kind of every so often to see kind of, is it time for me to go home now? And as you might imagine with a system like that, people got wildly disproportionate sentences, in fact, because of this discretion. And there were no factors or guidance about how the judges were to determine which in that massive range was the appropriate sentence. So there was lots of concern about this and the use of parole, as we kind of have had in Illinois. It's been abolished. So that system got phased out all over the country in different ways. And we got instead a much more regimented system with the sentencing guidelines. And that came about in the 1980s. And they were extremely regimented for federal crimes. And some states kind of followed suit with very, very detailed things. Here's what the baseline is. Here's what will justify going up. Here's what will justify going down. And there's lots and lots of rules about that. And there are 3 strikes rules as well that also said, like, if someone is a repeat offender after 3 times, they're going to be, put away for life in prison. It's actually an interesting shoplifting case connected to that, to go back to our theme of shoplifting, where a gentleman had shoplifted, I think, under $20, but it was his 3rd offense, and so he got life in prison in California. We moved in that direction of like a lot of regimentation, and the hope was that this would create greater regularity in sentences, at least at the federal level. Lots of states didn't do that, but on the federal level, we did. About 10 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that those sentencing guidelines were the Congress, via the Sentencing Commission, gave very, very specific guidance to judges and didn't let them deviate, that was unconstitutional, that was usurping the judicial role. And so now we are back to where we were, kind of, where legally speaking, judges don't actually have to do this extremely precise balancing, but a lot of judges grew up in a system where that existed and so don't actually deviate that much from it, but some have I would say returned, but some of them were too young to have returned to, but some of them now do have this like freewheeling approach again, and so we're back to where we were before in some ways. So that's not an answer to your question, it's just that we have, over the past 75 years, grappled with it.
Scott online has, he says it's a spiritual question that kind of goes along with this. Can our judicial system be like, if you know the movie musical Les Miserables, can our judicial system be like the kind bishop who forgave Jean Valjean for stealing the church's silver candlesticks?
That's beautiful. So, as some of you know, in Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, that was made into a very famous musical and movie, there is a man who steals a loaf of bread to feed his family, and he's given like a decade in jail, something like that, for stealing a single piece of bread. And as soon as he gets released, he's taken in by a very kindly bishop, and the person is absolutely penniless. And it's kind of similar to our current moment. He's kind of branded as a thief. So there's not really much that he can do in terms of seeking employment and things of this nature. So the kind bishop takes him in, and Jean Valjean steals the silver from the church. And he is apprehended very quickly after he has done so, and the police take him back to the bishop and say, we found this man with this silver. We know he could not have, acquired it legally. Just confirm that he has indeed stolen this from you. And the bishop says, that is indeed my silver, but I actually have more silver that he forgot. I'm meant to give him all of it. Of course, the police are shocked and confused and whatever, but they unhand him. The bishop gives him more, and he tells him essentially kind of go off and be a good man. So Jean Valjean does do that for the most part. So the question, returning us to the question part of it, is can we imagine our judicial system being like the good bishop? I think that will require a really radical reimagining of how we structure our criminal justice system. But I think that there's possibilities for being gracious in terms of the sentences that are handed down, working with people who do make mistakes of various kinds. And also thinking about the key thing that is part of Jean Valjean's whole story, which is that a big part of the reason for all of the crimes that he commits in the story is poverty. That is the root cause. And by giving Jean Valjean all of this silver, literally, he does help with his poverty, and Jean Valjean later is able to, essentially become a mayor. Like, he does all these great things. It's a really fun adventure that he goes on, but he is enabled by giving this kind of new lease on life to be able to contribute to his community in really important ways.
My niece is the vice president of Tractor Supply, and her husband, they met because he was in charge of video surveillance at the stores. And one of the things that we talk about sometimes at the family gatherings is that people aren't aware that every place but the changing rooms are on film. And the amount of employees that know that and still try to get away with it, they tell me, and I just can't believe some of the stories. So it's just, there are no dares anymore because you're on film, candid camera.
Yeah, that is so true.
Is that the filming and surveillance, has that detoured people?
So there's so much to say here. So first of all, those are typically, that's yet another crime, because usually the employee has been put in a position of trust with respect to the item, so that's embezzlement often, and different crime. But yeah, these, so that's a different crime, A. B, does it deter? I'm not sure. I'm not aware of the evidence about this. One thing that I do know from just the little that I've learned about how stores react to shoplifting is that, especially in smaller establishments, in big establishments, there's like really good protocols about how cameras and all that sort of stuff work. But in a lot of smaller stores, even if there's a camera going, they might very quickly video over it. There may not be someone who actually monitors it. And so it may not serve as a very sufficient deterrent, especially against, say, when it's an inside job.
I have a question about what happens to people who are wrongly imprisoned with that whole, the thing at Northwestern where they have determined that a lot of people who are in prison were actually not guilty. What is done to help them get back into society? Because some of them have been in prison for a long time. And when you're putting on an application, do you say you've been convicted of a felony? Because most places, they won't hire you.
Yeah, great question. So the question is kind of what happens when someone is falsely accused? Well, there's kind of, falsely accused and convicted. There obviously are two kinds of groups. There are those who have been legally exonerated, so they've been shown by a court order that they actually didn't do this, and those who haven't, but say they were still falsely accused. And so there's the Innocence Project that's run at a lot of different places, and wrongful convictions centers that work on these sorts of issues. So when people are actually legally exonerated, sometimes there are monetary judgments in their favor as a result of often some sort of misconduct on behalf of the state in their prosecution process or the policing before that. And in some of those cases, there are big judgments and people get lots of money and they can use that to rebuild their lives in certain kinds of ways. I happen to participate just a little bit with the Northwestern Prison Education Program. And there are a number of students, they're all convicted felons, who participate in the program. A number of them claim, to my mind, somewhat credibly, that they were indeed falsely imprisoned. Not in the sense that, like, they were doing nothing at all wrong and then suddenly they were picked up by police. But sometimes it's like, I was doing such and so thing that's not legal, but not the thing that I was convicted of, where they could be really different in terms of the consequences, right? If you were out doing a string of shopliftings, but someone identifies you have been in place at a burglary or a robbery, or worse, a robbery that goes wrong that ends in someone's death, like, that's really different. It's not like I was not stealing anything, but I wasn't doing that. Really different legal consequences. And so a number of these men, almost all of them are men, the prisons that I worked with, claim to be falsely convicted. And, in many of those cases, there was no exoneration. Sometimes there would be, deals struck eventually once there was a realization that maybe there wasn't that exactly, but maybe they've run out of processes to actually prove, like, getting true exoneration. So some sort of deal is struck where they still keep the criminal record, but they're let out a little bit early. Those sorts of people don't get any kind of financial payout, and rebuilding your life in that sort of circumstance can be really difficult. I've always said, I care tons about people who are falsely convicted. I think that's really important. But I actually think that our focus shouldn't begin and end there. So when I was a student in the legal clinic, I actually didn't work doing that sort of stuff. I did juvenile justice. And all the people that I work with were guilty of the crimes that they committed. They were quite clear about that. Everyone had done the thing that they were accused of. It was all clear. Sometimes there was video evidence, like it was not actually in dispute. The question for me, as I worked with those clients, was, what should we do with you now, even if you've done something wrong? Where is the grace that we should extend? It's not that I don't think the people who are trying to get people off death row are not doing, God's work. That's great that you're doing those for this, but most people aren't in that situation. Most people have actually done something wrong, and the question is, what should we do? Should we cut them off forever, or is there a way to reintegrate them? Is there a way to extend them grace and help rebuild their lives?
So this is more of a thought than a question. How do you get to 75 million people doing this, if that in fact is the number? And you also mentioned the stores build the cost of theft into their pricing model, which partially probably contributes, among many other things, how you get to $75 million, or people rather. So, I think there's a relationship there, but it feels like we're kind of victims. The people who walk the high ground are paying a tax for those who are getting free stuff, again, which kind of makes you feel like you're a victim. But I think victim is your topic for next week. But anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, there's so much in there to unpack. So, are we running short on time? Are we good? We're good. Good. We have tons of time. Good. I think I'll say like two and a half thoughts. So one is, I definitely feel you about this kind of circle. Dan and I, as Dan mentioned beforehand, lived in Louisiana for a time. Louisiana has the highest car insurance rates in the country. They're outrageous. I can tell you for real, my car insurance monthly was more than my car payment. And I had a new car. Like, this was it. Mind you, I also was like under 30 and unmarried at the time, so there's like some things. But I had no accents on my record. Like, this was really quite high. And not surprisingly, lots of people drive uninsured in Louisiana, which then raises the cost of insurance even further. Totally understand that sort of cycle, and that is exactly a thing that's going on in the case of the shoplifting. So that's thought one. Thought two about this is that people do shoplift for a variety of reasons. And so in the survey that I mentioned, that this was done by the website Lending Tree, they surveyed about 1,000 people, maybe it was 2,000 people, to figure out kind of whether people shoplifted and like why. And there was just, I was surprised by the variety of reasons. So there were people who would say things like, they needed food, the prices were too high, et cetera, things like that. But there were also reasons like, I wanted to see how easy it is to shoplift, especially at self-checkout. And there are reasons like I think that the store is gouging all of us, so I don't think that I should have to pay this. Or just a variety of sorts of reasons. So that's kind of the meat of it. Like people shoplift for a lot of different reasons. And the thing about lifetime prevalence is that lives usually, hopefully, are long. And so people have very different reasons at different points of their lives. Teenagers might think things like that, I just want to see how easy it is. Like I want to get away with a kind of thrill. To people who are in more desperate financial situations. So they have just all sorts of reasons why. And so I wouldn't think that's the only one. And the last thing I'd say, which is kind of a half-formed thought, is with crime in general, this is always something that we're all paying for, both on the front end, like with things like all the cost that stores and all of us have to put into security, like that's not costless. People who have alarm systems or whatever that they purchase, or club for your car, or all those things are costs that we wouldn't have to pay if there wasn't crime, right? So all of us are always paying on the front end and often paying on the back end, like sending someone to jail for 3 years because they shoplifted and left through the emergency exit, even though they just only, had something that was like $10, that's a huge cost to incarcerate this person for years. And so we're always paying. And the question we have to ask is, what's the smarter way to pay? Like if there's a way to prevent someone from doing this sort of stuff up front, what cost is that versus these other costs that we have to bear?
So we just have a couple minutes left. So I've got 2 questions for you that are absolutely easy to answer in the 2 minutes we've got left. But related to what you just said, because you're not just a legal scholar, you are a moral philosopher, a person who thinks a lot about doing right and doing wrong, and what does that mean, and what are we doing when we're making those kinds of judgments. What is your concern from that lens about a society that that treats minor crimes in the way that we do? What does that say about us in totality?
Yeah, easy question. Yeah, I think it suggests a couple of things. One is just that we don't put ourselves enough in the mindset of like what would make someone do these sorts of things. And I think a thing that we do also that I think is, I was just referencing a little bit about the kind of the front end and back end costs. There's just not enough thinking that we do collectively about, suppose we make the decisions, we're going to send someone to jail for 10 years or 5 years or 2 years. What does that cost? What does that cost? Not just in dollars and cents. Dollars and cents, of course, matter. But what does that cost communities? What happens when a neighborhood is mostly hollowed out, there's not a lot of adults around? What happens in that situation where kids grow up in a place like that? What happens to business? What happens to, like, we just don't think enough about the kind of costs about that. And so to me, it suggests a kind of moral short-sightedness that we see a problem right in front of us, so we want to do something about it. That is kind of a head-on type of response. Like, this person's done this thing right now, so let's send them to jail right now. instead of thinking, well, what happens downstream if we send them to jail? What happens when they get out, if they get out? What are the costs associated with this? Are there cheaper ways to do this? Both things that are less costly for them and for us as a society. I remember a mentor of mine saying, the easiest thing to do in Springfield is introduce a bill that that says give more money to the Bureau of Prisons. Because people were like, yeah, sure, it seems like a good thing. Whereas there might be all sorts of things that that we could get bigger bang for our buck in terms of helping our society be safer.
Thank you. And then the last question, but Raff will be here, so you can come up and ask him questions. We've been focusing on like practical implications, right?
Yes.
In this series. So what is one or two practical things that you'd like these good folks, these good church-going folks, to take away and do or try in their lives?
Great question as well. Also super easy. Yeah.
I love you very much.
I think he's a plant.
So, most of us are not like a judge. We can't hand down a sentence. Most of us, when we're voting, aren't voting only on the basis of someone's criminal justice record or credentials or whatever. So we can't do all those sorts of things. I do think that we can try to extend grace in various ways in our everyday lives and let that trickle down into other areas. I remember hearing a story, and this, I just thought about this as you asked the question, about it's a friend of a friend who's a prosecutor in DC, and a man came into his home. The man was inebriated, had had too much to drink, came into his home and went upstairs into this man's bedroom. And the man was there with his wife, his child was there, and he screamed out, like, "What are you doing here?" And, the man thought it was his home. That was the story. He thought it was his home. Apparently lots of homes look similar. And the prosecutor, his door was unlocked. So this man was faced with a question about what to do about this. Because technically, this is a breaking and entering, so this is a burglary, perhaps. The really serious crime, this person can go to jail. And the question is, well, you could, especially because you're a prosecutor, you could urge one of your colleagues in the area to press for really stiff charges, or you could be a little bit more forgiving. Like, this was a relatively honest mistake. No, this person shouldn't do those sorts of things. And the question is, well, which path to take? And so I'll leave it for later to tell you what he did take. But yeah, that's the sort of thing I think in our own lives we can think about. How can we be gracious with others?
Big hand for Raff, please. And keep that going. A big hand for yourselves. Thank you for being part. Clap for yourselves. Thank you all for being on this journey so far. We do have one more week where we are talking about victims, and at some point this week I'll figure out what I meant by that. And so please come back one more time, and then we are into Holy Week. Thank you all. Have a good day. Please be careful out in the terrible weather.
Yeah.
God bless.